always with populations, always, doesn't matter if the population has only 20 members, but it's already a plurality, it's already a collectivity, and a population of entities, each of which is a singular individual, each of which has a singular identity, because it was produced by a process that's historical. This applies, by the way, to the stuff that physicists study too, like atoms. You know, normally, when you ask a physicist, what is hydrogen? He will tell you, well, hydrogen in general, that is the reified generality of hydrogen, is an atom that has a single proton in its nucleus and a single electron orbiting around. That is the essence of being hydrogen, and that's what hydrogen in general is. Now, I'm not going to deny that. It is true that hydrogen atoms have a single proton in their nucleus, and it is true that their identity is guaranteed by that single proton, in the sense that if you add another proton, that atom becomes helium. And if you add a third proton, that becomes lithium. So, yes, it is what guarantees its identity, is having just that single proton. However, in the ontology that we've been discussing in this class, in this Deleuzean ontology that I've been trying to flesh out for you, there is no such thing as hydrogen in general. All that exists out there is a very large population of hydrogen atoms that were born one at a time via a process called nucleosynthesis on a star in one place, or in a star on another place, or in some intense cosmic phenomenon such as explosion of a star in another place. In order to synthesize atoms, in order to bring it into existence in a historical way, you need very, very high intensities. Intensities of pressure, intensities of temperature, which you can only find them in the cores of stars, or as I said, during supernova explosions, or other kinds of cosmic phenomena that are also incredibly intense. And despite the fact that today we cannot tell what the history of every hydrogen atom is, because we cannot trace it to the particular star that produced it, we know it was produced somewhere. We know there's a factory somewhere where that assemblage of protons and electrons was put together. And despite the fact that we don't know where it is, we know that it happened. And therefore we know that each one of those atoms is an individual singularity, despite the fact that they all look the same. Now, from a Deleuzean would also immediately add, wait, and in addition to that, we also want to know the distribution of variation in that population. Because, yes, every single hydrogen atom has a single proton in the middle, but they can also have a neutron. Because a neutron doesn't have any electrical charge, you can add 1 or 2, and you can add 1 to hydrogen and create a variation of hydrogen from deuterium. Or you can add another neutron and add a variation of hydrogen called tritium. I can't remember right now the name of it, but there is variation even in the simplest atoms. And cosmologists use the distribution of isotopes. Isotopes are the names of these variants, or what is basically the same atom. The distribution of isotopes in populations of atoms to determine all kinds of things about cosmic history and about the processes that produce them and so on. So the exact same ideas we've been using right now, yesterday, for instance, with respect to populations of organizations, in which what you take is the entire organization and then you compute the statistics. You want to know the statistical distribution of the variation. You're less concerned with what remains the same than with what varies and in what proportions. So there is no such thing as hydrogen in general. And yet, the majority of scientists will think in those terms, because that is the Greek way of thinking about it, and scientists want to have their pedigree going back to the axiomatics of Euclid. Now, from our point of view, we need to do the opposite. We need to consider scientific fields, individual ones, that have been born at a specific moment of time. Yes, they will share certain aspects of the scientific method are shared, but there are many things that vary. As I just said, whereas for physicists study interactions in which the molecules only collide against one another and don't change identity. chemists study interactions in which the molecules that interact change identity. Oxygen and hydrogen interacting, becoming water, for instance, and giving rise to an emergent entity we call water with its own emergent properties. I mentioned this at the beginning of yesterday's class. Whereas hydrogen and oxygen by themselves are fuels, combustible, and you throw them in the fire and they make the fire, burn more intense. Water, which is just made out of these two fuels, puts out the fire, which means that the chemist cannot simply think, well, we already know what water does because we know what oxygen and hydrogen do. We don't know what it does until you synthesize it and you actually test it with something in reality. Coming in, guys. So the same idea should apply to scientific fields themselves. We want to study them as a population. We don't want to only emphasize what is common to all of them, but we want to emphasize what's different from one to the other. And once you begin studying a population of scientific fields, you can ask different questions than when you talk about science as a rarefied generality. You can begin asking yourself the question, for instance, is the number of scientific fields increasing every decade, or is it decreasing? Because if it's decreasing, it means that maybe science is converging on a final truth. The content of some scientific fields is absorbed by others. There's less and less fields, and then we can extrapolate into the future and say, well, if there's 10 less scientific fields every decade, and right now there's only 100 left, well, in 10 decades they will all fuse into one super scientific field, and that super scientific field will contain the final and absolute truth. Well, this is something you can check, right? Unlike science in general, that you cannot check anything about it because it doesn't exist. The number of scientific fields as a function of time can be checked. And when you do check it, you realize that the number is increasing, constantly increasing every decade, diverging, not converging on a final truth, discovering more and more details about reality that in turn lead to another scientific field to form which studies even farther details about reality. And it's diverging because, as Deleuze would say, reality itself is divergent. And when I get to that point, I'm going to try to prove this to you later on. But by moving from science as a rarefied generality to the ontology of populations of singular individuals that we've been using here, we already saw how it applies to other areas. Today we're just going to apply it here. You get to prove to scientists themselves that their field is not approaching little by little some final truth. And that is a philosophical contribution. Because they themselves are not going to do it. They love their essentialism. They love to talk about science in general because it just makes them feel more Greek. It just makes them feel more connected to that incredible pedigree going back to Aristotle. And it makes them feel that the final axiomatic is here any minute. Deleuze attacked this idea very early on in his work, but it really only came out fully fleshed out in a chapter in 1,000 Plateaus called Nomadology, a chapter in which they deal with a variety of subjects, some of them having nothing to do with scientific matters, such as the nomads from the steppes and the distinction between the mode of living of the nomads, which is a humanity, and you may want to hear this, even though it's not directly related to the subject today. When humanity went from hunter-gatherers, which we were for hundreds of thousands of years, and began domesticating nature, and through that domestication began moving towards civilization, there were two divergent ways in which this could be done. Some humans, some hunter-gatherers, inhabiting the plains of Mesopotamia, discovered that they could manipulate the genes of certain grasses, the ancestors of today's corn, today's wheat, today's barley,